First Spin. Welcome to First Spin, a show where I learn how to use the parallax propeller without having any prior programming experience. And rather than do this on my own, I have enlisted the help of two hackery sorts of experts who scared me last week because they could have messed my computer up. Dude, it's still traumatic. It's like still quite traumatic. You know, it's still fresh in my mind that my computer, my baby computer, could be messed up. You know, by
it's always could be messed up if you don't keep it safe.
I guess. I suppose. But still, I mean, you know, a simple program, because you always think like a compiler is going to be a nice protective cocoon, like a what do they call those sandboxes? Right? I always think it could be like a sandbox, but I guess it's an actual program.
I think the propeller is your sandbox.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
It keeps your code from getting out of hand.
Perhaps. The problem is I use it to interface with my computer, though. Like serial terminal style.
That's pretty safe.
Is it?
Yeah.
All right. I'm just making sure, because you never know. Anyway, so last week we kind of touched on sigma delta modulation again as the elusive question mark topic of the year. But in part of it, the app note mentioned using counters. And counters are like the fox and the grapes. Is that the right Aesop fable? You know, where like he's always jumping for the grapes and he can never get it, but he always keeps jumping for the grapes. That's like what I think counters are for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and every time I mention counters to Roy or Whisker, they're just like, "Oh my gosh, oh gosh."
Well, the counters can do a lot, and we've covered them quite a bit. And I don't think they're very hard, but you seem to have this mental block that makes them hard in your mind.
Yes.
And I think it's just because there's so many options. You think it has to be hard because there's so many options.
It's an infinitesimal like array of options.
Infinitesimal is not what you think it means.
It is.
That means
it's
infinitely small.
It's a crap ton. Now coined here at First Spin.
No, but see, infinitesimal means it's really small, and you actually mean really large. So you mean infinite.
Infinite.
Just infinite.
How about infinitesimally huge? Will that work?
No, that's backwards.
Paradox.
I like making brains hurt.
That's like saying jumbo shrimp, right?
Jumbo shrimp. So good. So good. But okay, fine. So like crap ton of options.
And as previously defined on First Spin, a crap ton is a unit of measurement that is exactly one thing that Addie doesn't want to do.
Right. A lot.
It's more than 3.
Hey!
It's like 1, 2, 3
dude,
crap ton.
Dude, do you see all of these different options? You have different control modes. You have different, counter modes. You have different PLL things. You have different B pins and A pins that you can do. It's crazy.
And some of these are used for driving the pin output wise, and some of them are only used for input on the pin. And
right. So today I think we were going to focus on the PLL div portion, but for those noobs like myself who want a quick and dirty refresh course. Okay, ready? Each cog has 2 counters, counter A, counter B. Each counter has freak and
FRQA and FRQB, and then
PHSA and PHSB associated with it.
And those are for frequency and phase.
Right.
That's what those stand for.
Right. So each counter has a frequency and phase.
Well, and then what happens is, in most of the modes we've talked about, every time a clock cycle goes by, FRQ X, whichever one, is added to the equivalent PHS X.
And so FRQA swings.
Yeah, FRQA gets added to PHSA, and FRQB gets added to PHSB.
Right.
when you're using the PLL, NC0, or duty modes, that's what happens.
Right.
And then with the other modes that we've only sort of touched on, what happens is that it's not every system clock, but every time the pin that you set up as the input pin that is driving the counter changes state according to the configuration, then it will count one, and that will cause FRQA to get added to PHSA or B, either one, depending on how you've configured things.
Right.
So that's the difference. One is you're driving the pin as an output, and clock signal, you're causing the pin to toggle based on your configuration. The other one, you set the pin as an input, and whatever the pin does causes the counter to count the action of the pin.
Which
or
is why
pins.
we call them counters.
Right. So that's why there's when you have pause detector or pause edge detector or neg detector, what that means is for the pause detector, it means when A is positive, right? So when A is high, it counts up.
Oh.
Right. And so pause edge detector is when it goes from being low to being high.
Okay.
Right. And neg edge detector is the opposite. So right, it's just it's they're just detecting the state of the pin or the changing state of the pin.
Roy and Whisker are set as pause detectors, and you're the clock source, the little external source there, and you're understanding when it finally goes high. You click over
Right.
to another
another topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the whole set at the bottom where it's logic, never, logic not A and not B, logic A and not B, all those are based on the two pins involved, so A and B, whatever their state is, if it satisfies that logic equation, then it will cause the counter to count one. So, logic A equals B, if A is low and B is low, then it'll count. If A is high and B is high, it'll count. If there's A is low and B is high or the opposite, then it won't count.
Huh. Okay. I guess.
And on those, it's, what's happening is every time the system clock goes around, it'll do a count for the state of those pins being those states.
Okay.
And there's a little, for the edge detector ones, there's a little bit of a note there. I don't know if you saw on the chart where it has the little ones and the little twos.
Yes.
Next to the letters. If you look down at the bottom, it's telling you the input delayed by 1 clock and the input delayed by 2 clocks.
Yes.
So what they're saying there is that it's actually the state of the pin 1 clock ago and 2 clocks ago.
I see.
So if the so pause edge detector, next to it says A with a little 1 and not A with a little 2. So the not A is delayed from 2 clocks ago.
Okay.
And then the A is delayed from just 1 clock ago. So if 2 clocks ago the pin was off and 1 clock ago the pin was on, then it will count.
Oh, complex.
You see what I mean? If you notice, all of them are at least 1 clock delayed. They all have the little 1 or a 2. Yeah. So what you're actually doing is at the time when it's going to count, it means that the pin 1 system clock ago was in the state that you're detecting. So there is if you're running at 80 megahertz, there's a little 6 nanosecond delay between the pin changing state and the clock counter actually counting. It's a really tiny delay, but it's something that they have to note here because it's important for some hardware specifications that they know exactly the delays.
Can I ask something?
For most usage, it won't really matter, right? You're just going to set it up, and when the pin changes state, you're going to count a number and you're going to be happy that it counted.
Okay.
It's just It's just that's what those notes are there for, is to tell you there is actually
Exactly.
this tiny little bit of delay there,
Yeah.
but you most of the time don't need to worry about it. That's all that I explained that, so that because like you saw those numbers and you're probably wondering what the hell they were.
Yep. Pretty much.
So I was explaining it so you would understand, and then now you can just kind of pretend they're not there because you don't really care.
Right. Although I will at some point, I'm sure, ask you about them again and be like, "What? We've never talked about this." So I thought the interesting thing, for those who didn't notice
And
already,
that's when our negative edge detection
right,
triggers.
right, is that Whisker. That's so mean. Um, that if you look at the descriptions of the counter modes in, say, the app note,
Mhm.
or if you're looking at the link where I wrote out my own Addy style app note for
Yeah.
counters, uh, there's single ended and there's differential.
Mhm.
And if you'll notice, in single ended, only a pin is designated. And then in
Right.
differential, both A pin and B pin are designated.
Right.
And B
And
pin is almost always, well, always actually,
no,
I think.
it is always.
It is
B
always
pin
the
is always the
inverse.
inverse of A pin.
Right.
And the reason for that, it's called differential mode, and it has some electrical meaning. Sometimes in like noisy situations, electrical noisy situations, they'll use differential signaling instead of just straight normal serial signaling.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is because with differential signaling, if the voltage changes on the wires a little bit, there's still a difference between them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you use the difference between them to be the indication of the signal. So when A is high and B is low, the difference will be a positive change,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if A is low and B is high, then the difference will be a negative change. And so they can use that to indicate, a positive change equals a 1 and a negative change equals a 0.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that that's important is, say you're normally on a signaling system where it goes from 0 to 5 volts, but in the noise, it causes that to vary up and down a little bit
Mm-hmm.
by, a volt or two,
That's pretty significant.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you might incorrectly call something a 1 that isn't, because it's, 2 or 3 volts up. But with differential, you'd still have the positive or negative difference
Right.
between them. So you would be able to more accurately discern what the signal is by using two wires and having the differential between them being how you detect the signal.
Okay.
And that's why this mode is here, is that it's useful for doing that kind of thing.
Right. Right. Yep. So that's the difference. So that's the relationship between A pin and B pin in terms of single ended versus differential. But
Mhm.
today we were actually going to focus on PLL DIV, right?
Well, it's just the
Lil div.
PLL mode of the counter, which uses the PLL div section of the control register.
So is that the PLL internal, single ended, and differential? Those three, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
those three are all the PLL mode. That you
Okay.
turn on that mode, and in internal, it's not really useful for
Anything but
counter stuff.
videos?
It's used with the video modes
Okay.
stuff.
Which we'll talk about in a future
Right.
episode. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the single-ended and differential is where you're basically feeding the counter into a PLL circuit, and then the PLL circuit then drives the output pin, and so it allows you to do higher frequency than you normally would be able to do.
Okay.
With the propeller.
So I have a bit of an explanation that I've written out, but you are more than welcome to explain to me how that works.
Okay, so first of all, there's the basic idea that a PLL circuit is a phase lock loop. We don't really. There's a couple of really good tutorials out there about how those work and why they work, but just accept that
Magic.
it's a black box that you feed it in a frequency from something, and it will take that frequency and lock onto it, and then output a multiplying of that frequency.
More
So
magic.
2 times or 10 times that frequency.
Right.
And so in the case of the propeller counter one, the PLL circuit takes the input frequency and multiplies it by 16.
Always 16.
It always multiplies it by 16.
Okay.
And then that result of the input frequency times 16, you can then choose one of 8 possible values from that using the PLL div to get which frequency you actually end up using.
So first, let's backstep just a little bit. Where's this input coming from?
From the counter. So you set up your FRQ and PHS
Okay.
registers
Okay.
to output a particular frequency.
Like 4 megahertz or something like that.
Right. So in the case of the propeller counter PLL circuit, they're spec'd at handling between 4 and 8 megahertz as input.
Okay.
Some people have taken them a little bit outside of that range and gotten a little more range than is spec'd.
Okay.
But
for optimal functioning,
right,
best is between 4 and 8.
For the certified reliable operation, you should only input between 4 and 8 megahertz.
Okay.
So you would set up the counter like you normally would to say, calculate a value in FRQ so that PHSA wraps at a rate that is 4 megahertz or 5 megahertz or something between 4 and 8 megahertz.
Right.
And
then that will go through the PLL, this black box.
Right.
Which will get multiplied that hertz by 16.
It will take the 4 megahertz. Let's say we're using 4 megahertz.
Yep.
It'll take the 4 megahertz and multiply it by 16,
Yep.
which gives you 64 megahertz.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And then depending on the PLL div setting, which is that field in the control register for the counter, it will divide that resultant 64 megahertz by one of 8 values.
Okay.
And one of them is divided by 1, right? So you would just get 64 megahertz.
Right.
And then, so if you set it up for that, then the pin would toggle at 64 megahertz.
Okay.
Would go on and off 64 million times a second.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
But you can also choose to set it to divide by 64, and then it would go on and off at 1 megahertz.
Right.
And the options are between dividing by 128 through dividing by 1. And it's the powers of 2. So 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1.
Right.
And so
magic numbers.
Exactly. So if you put in 8 megahertz, then you would get 128 megahertz as the output from the PLL, and then you would pick, divide by 1 would give you 128 megahertz as the output. So the pin would toggle at 128 megahertz, which is faster than the clock rate normally of the processor, right? We normally run at 80 megahertz.
Right.
So it allows you to do some stuff in
faster.
a higher frequency range for radio or, signaling at a much higher signal rate.
Which I've done.
And some people have done, like I said, they've taken it a little bit higher than 8 megahertz and gotten, I think, as much as 150, maybe even approaching 200 megahertz.
Okay.
But like I said, it's not within spec, so it may or may not be reliable.
Okay.
I've never personally done it. Other people, there's some forum posts talking about it and what kind of, circuits that they've used it with, because you can get a little bit more reliable results for this kind of overclocking as long as you feed the propeller a good power source and have good decoupling capacitors on it and set up your circuit appropriately. Then you can make it reliable for these out of range numbers.
So let me just re-explain it for those who might not have gotten it. I think your explanation is fine because I understand it.
Uh-huh.
And I think my explanation via the Tumblr is fine because I wrote it. But I'll go through it one more time just for those who are not quite sure. So, first, you have this. If we look at the app note and you have these bits going from 0 to 31, you'll see you have the counter mode, the PLL div, B pin, A pin. Okay, and say you want your pin to toggle, like a certain amount, say 80 megahertz or 128 megahertz or what have you. You can do that by using a PLL counter mode, and that would be the second, either the third or the fourth mode in the table, under counter modes. So PLL single ended is probably actually the one that you'd want to use. And what happens is you calculate out your your frequency and your phase to go at a certain speed. So let's say 4 megahertz, right? What we were talking about.
So you would calculate a FRQ value that would cause phase PHS to wrap at 4 megahertz.
Right.
Right.
And then this PLL, so then if you look at the diagrams for where these signals go, you'll see that the megahertz always end up going into the PLL, this little PLL magic box.
Mm-hmm.
And so this PLL, once this 4 megahertz goes into this PLL magic box, the PLL multiplies it by 16. So say you go from 4 to 64.
Right.
And then from here, you have 8 options. You have, the PLL will say, okay, well, tell me which of these 8 options you want me to use, or what you want to use. So that'd be 1x or 1/2 or 1/4 or 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/64, 1/128. So essentially dividing by 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. So then, and that's where the PLL div portion of that, I guess, line of code is, where it's a 3-bit field, which gives you 8 potential values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
0 to 7.
Right. 0 to 7, where 0 means 128. And 7,
dividing by 128.
Right.
And 7 means dividing by 1.
Right.
Right.
So once you say, okay, in this 3-bit field that, let's say we want 1, we want the 64 megahertz. Then whatever you select, that PLL will go to the A pin, and the A pin will end up toggling at that PLL rate.
Right. And just one little extra piece, it actually goes into the output box there, and it could actually be driving both A and B pin. Remember, B being the inverse of A.
Right.
So it can do both. It's just the way you selected it, it's only going to do A.
Right.
But you could have it do both. It's not just going to A. It could go to both.
Right.
That's the only
caveat
there.
Yep. Just depends on which one, whether or not you choose single-ended or differential.
Right.
So that's what that particular one means.
Right.
And I'm trying to think. So that's PLLX, right? So would that X be like PLL1 or PLL2? Like that?
Right. So that the PLLX there is just, it's saying X because you can choose the dividing value.
Okay.
Right. So it's 1 through 128 with the fixed, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16.
Okay.
So that's all that is.
Okay.
It's deciding that.
All right. And let's see. I think we have just enough time for are you guys sure we went through PHSX carry? Like,
well, we can cover it again.
Okay.
I mean, I know we've talked about how, when you use the NCO mode, which is numerically controlled oscillator, that causes it to, the PHS register counts up for every time FRQ, and the top bit, the 31st bit of PHS,
Yep.
It's actually the bit 31, which is the 32nd bit,
Right.
the last bit. Whatever state it's in, then the output pin will match that.
Right.
So
So
you
if
count it and it wraps and it causes it to have. But the signal that outputs is always a square wave. So you always have, equal amount of time off and equal amount of time on.
right. So
Right? It's just
this is
faster or slower.
so this is the idea. So like when you're adding binary numbers and you're clicking up by 1, right?
Mhm.
You'll end up clicking, let's go from 0, 0, 0, right? We go
Right.
0, 0, 0, then 0, 0, 1, then 0, 1, 0,
Mhm.
0, 1, 1,
Mhm.
0.
No, then 1, 0, 0.
1. Okay, so then when it hits that 1, 0, 0, you notice that topmost bit turns on and the other bits below it turn off, right? Because that's
Mhm.
just how it works. So
Right.
same with this one, same with this like 32-bit number. When this 32-bit PHS number hits that top bit and it turns on, then all the
Mhm.
other bits underneath it go off, right? So it's like a 1 and 31 zeros below that,
Right.
right? And
And then
so once
it
that
counts up.
and well, 1 second. So once that 32nd bit turns on, the
Mhm.
pin that you've designated this counter to be in relation with turns on. So it
Right.
puts out a 1.
Right.
And it stays on for as long as that 32nd bit is a 1.
Is on.
Right.
Yeah.
And it'll take as much time to like
Count up.
that 1 is at the halfway mark
Right.
between 0 and where
all ones.
right, and all ones. Exactly. So that's what PHSX 31 means. So when that top bit turns on,
Right.
then the A pin turns on.
Right.
Now, say you have all ones, right? But we're still adding 1 because we're still continually,
Right.
adding.
And so the PHS register wraps back around to 0.
Right. But between that, there is actually this little carry flag that
Mhm.
signifies that you're past all
You
of
carry.
the max.
You went past the amount
Right.
of the register.
Right. You went past what this PHXX can handle, and so it's gonna put a little carry flag and be like, "Hey, this is too much," And so
Right.
at that point in time, once that carry flag is turned on, then the A pin will turn on. But
Well,
it'll
you have to
only
be
be
set.
on.
Hold on. You have to set yourself into duty cycle mode for that to be true.
Yeah. Well,
We
that's
haven't
what.
mentioned
Yeah.
that. We're still talking about NCO mode. Now we're talking
I'm
about
just
duty
talking
cycle
about-
mode.
Right. So if we just look at the table for the A pin output, that's what I'm
Right.
going after.
Right.
So
if you have FRQA set at 1 and PHSA counts up and wraps for 1 pulse out of 4 billion, the carry bit will be set.
Yep.
And so you'll get a 1/4 billionth cycle of the pin being on.
Right.
So at an 80 megahertz rate, you'll get 1 clock cycle where it's on,
right.
And then 4 billion, 200 million, all ones.
Right.
That number, that many clock cycles will go by, and it'll be off. And what that amounts to, it's about 53.5 or 54 seconds. So yeah, 54 seconds of it being off, and then a little tiny 180 millionth of a second, it'll be on.
Right. And it always it'll also depend on your frequency.
Your FRQ setting. Yeah.
Yep. Because if your frequency setting is large enough that you're overflowing every time, or you're overflowing, more often than not, then that pin will be on more often than that one every 54 seconds.
Right. So just as you can sort of extrapolate out. So if we put a 2 into FRQ, then that bit will be on twice during
54
that 54 seconds.
Right.
And if we put 100, in there, it'll be on 100 times during that 54 seconds.
Right.
And if we put, 10 million in there, it'll be on 10 million times versus off. And it works out, right? If you keep going larger and larger numbers, once you get up to like 2 billion or 3 billion in the FRQ register, then you start having the pin be on more than it's off.
Right. Right.
So you'll carry a whole bunch of times in a row, and every time you carry, the pin stays on.
Right.
Because if you think about it, if you have 3 billion and the number can only be 4 billion 200
Some
something.
change, yeah.
Right. So you add 3 billion the first time, it'll fit. And so
the pin
it'll
will be
fit,
off.
and the pin will be off.
But
you add it again and it'll wrap.
Yep.
So the pin will be on, but your value will be 2 billion,
Right.
2 billion in the stored.
Right.
And so then you'll add 3 billion again and you'll wrap again. And now you'll have 1 billion in the register, and you add 3 billion and it'll fit. So the pin will be off.
Right.
But then you add you keep doing that, and you'll see that the pin goes on and off at a pretty regular rate.
Right.
And that's the duty cycle, right? So depending on what value you put in FRQ, you can get different percentages of the pin being off and on.
Right. And that, yes, so that's counters. And we're actually, Whisker's
right
like,
at the end here. Yeah.
We're
We
out of time.
timed it almost perfectly.
I know we did.
Almost. You guys always go a minute over.
We timed it. NCO
Always.
style.
Well, everyone.
Was that canned laughter? Okay, sorry. That was great.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
If you like this, you can find the show every Tuesday evening at firstspin.tv.
Yes.
You can also have it automatically download to your phone or iTunes or whatever, and there's a RSS link right there on the side of the page. And yeah, you can listen to it right on the page if you want to in your browser. Just click play. It's super easy.
Yep.
That's it for us for this week. We'll see you guys next week.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.